Good afternoon, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to be able to welcome you here today to our debate on the question, can we agree on common aspirations for global cooperation? My name is Anna-Katharina Hornitsch. I'm the director of the German Development Institute, and I have the honor to discuss this question in a minute with three participants: Dipesh Chakrabarti, Isabella Teixeira, and Elisabeth Heger. And of course, with you, the audience, I have seen that some interaction is possible through the Q&A channels. We will have 1 hour together and separated into a short introduction, of course, into the panel, then and then immediately move to our discussants. Now, the question on can we agree on common aspirations focuses on a reflection on international relations and on also development cooperation and development policy in many ways. How do we envision futures, different types of futures? How do we envision sustainable futures? And who envisions those that are being communicated in policy frameworks and agenda setting processes? This is what we'll reflect on, and I introduce you to our two speakers, Dipesh Chakrabarti and Isabella Teixeira. Dipesh Chakrabarti is a historian by training and holds a professorship in history, South Asian languages and civilizations at the University of Chicago. He is one of the founding fathers, I would say, and you can correct me in a minute, of subaltern studies and of post-colonial studies, and has contributed to these fields with numerous works, especially one concept that I think is well known to all of us is the concept of provincializing Europe. And I think that's very, very relevant for our discussion here today. And he was awarded the Toynbee Prize in 2014 for basically special contributions to the further development of social sciences and scientific theory. Welcome. We're very much looking forward to discussing with you. And I have the honor to introduce you to Isabella Teixeira. Isabella holds a PhD in environmental planning and was the Brazilian Minister of the Environment from 2010 to 2016. She has been shaping Brazilian environmental policy making for many, many years and still does so, and does so also on the multilateral and international level. She is the co-chair of the International Resource Panel of UN Environment. And we today have the honor, Isabella, to get to know your perspective on well, the aspirations on how sustainable futures can be, should be not only envisioned, but also then pursued through policymaking. So I'm looking forward to the discussion and would now like to open the floor immediately and invite both of you to share your initial thoughts on the topic, and then we move from there into a number of sort of basically a ping pong with questions and answers. Isabella, may I invite you to go first and share your perspectives with us?
Yes, thank you very much, Anna. My pleasure to see you again, and I'm very honored to have this opportunity to join Professor Dipesh and also Elisabeth. And I confess that I was really motivated when I read the invitation to discuss if we can agree common aspiration for global cooperation. Based on my political experience in the last around for almost 4 years that I'm full dedicated to public sector in my country and full dedicated for environmental policies, I have to believe that we need to do this, okay? Because, but of course, not necessarily based in our experience in the past. This is my first observation here, okay? I remember when it was in the beginning of my career that we joined the 90s, exactly after the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, and how the world came to have a new momentum of international cooperation that we believed it was very important to observe the new global confidence to cooperate internationally, and we renewed our belief in a nine-nation system, which was true. And I used to say this decade from the 90s was a golden decade exactly to, based on the West countries. This is very important to observe here because it brings together the world, that we need a new perspective, or you have new perspectives to cooperate internationally. So it was a decade based that start with Rio 92 conference with Sustainable Development Goals, and you went through the emergence of the new century, considering gender, human rights, cities, human settlements, quality of life, peace and security. I think that was really cities, how indeed it was the beginning of the well-succeed trajectory of the 90s. And when when we begin the new century, you have the 11th September, and it was something very hard to understand the setbacks that you were exposed as humankind. So I think that there is one point here that I'd like to highlight that is still it's very, very important, considering my perspective today in my country. We also agree that democracy, or the consolidation of democracies as a key political systems around the world. It was very important if you go into the international cooperation and if you're looking for, as you mentioned, address common aspirations to come together. What you have today is, in my opinion, you have to observe two or three things. The first one is to cooperate. In my opinion, we always need some common aspirations, but beyond national interests. This is, for me, something very important when you go into global crisis, as we have managed today the three tipping point nature global crisis. This is very important to observe, in my opinion, and also based on my experience. My second point here is that, unfortunately, what is bringing us together, I don't know if Professor Dipesh agrees with me, today is exactly not hope or aspiration, but threatens, risks, because climate crisis is bringing us into a climate fatalism world that sometimes it's in my perception, okay, I have the feelings that people are looking for to move forward, not necessarily to a common aspiration, but to have a better world, a fair or inclusive world, as in the past, but to address risks and threats, and also probably to have additional gaps between developing and developing economies. This is very important to observe because my feeling sometimes shows that we have part of the world discussing climate emergence, and we have another part of the world discussing economy emergency or economic urgency. This is very important to make clear when discussing common aspiration. And my third point here, I wanted to try to be provocative. I'm not sure if I'm doing this, but I hope that the Professor Dipesh can help us and bring really his perspective, that we are facing challenges today based on interconnect world, not only consider the globalization and also the digital technologies that bring us together, but also nature brings us together. But you cannot forget that we are not together considering politics. So this is very important also to observe how these new global arrangements consider the geopolitical arrangements around the world, that is completely different. That was in the last century. How indeed the climate and nature crisis will go, politics will go into this geopolitics, and how this will manage the impact international cooperation. So this means that we need to go beyond the short-term perspectives and understand the long-term perspectives. It's true, but it's not clear how indeed we will address, for example, vulnerabilities in social inequalities, and how we address climate and environmental rights, human rights that come into the human rights agenda. So you have some diversity of situations that I do believe it's the big challenges for international governance system and also international cooperation. But you cannot forget that, this is my perspective, that we need to understand or learn with our lessons of the past, and pay attention what is happening in this transition decade, and how indeed we can avoid some, in my opinion, some barriers, like the populism, the political populism around the world that is looking for to replace democracy, and to replace exactly, or to make difficult to have the innovative political rules arrangements to bring society together, and to make clear that we can have some, as I say, aspirations, and to come together into this century. So some thoughts only to try to be provocative, but also to see how a country like Brazil, I am part of my generation, we fought a lot to have democracy in our country, and today we are exposed to a lot of setbacks, political and economic setbacks, and social ones in this country, and under the umbrella of the democracy vulnerability. This is very, very important to be observed, very important to be analyzed, and how indeed this will impact international cooperation in the case of a country that used to play in the past, the last 30 years, as a bridge between developing and emerging economies and developing economies. So this is something, it's like a disruptive political process that we are exposed, this short-term perspective, that I hope that we can play in a different way this next years, and we can influence, be better aligned with the challenge of international cooperation that, in my perspective, must not be based only in the risks and vulnerabilities, but we need to understand the new political dimension of solidarity that the global crisis imposed to us. Something like this, only to try to share some thoughts, and never forget that what we are learning with the pandemic crisis, and how we are not able to manage global crisis last year and this year. The consequence, unfortunately, you have social inequalities, you have vaccine inequalities. This is something that we need to understand better in the next years, how we can learn with this experience, and how we can have common understanding of our challenges, based on the realities, of course, but not necessarily only based on the national interests. My feeling is that we need to be, need to be optimistic but pragmatic to understand how this new governance, global governance system will be established, considering climate arrangements and also nature transition. Thank you, Catherine. Back to you.
Thank you, Isabella. There's a pragmatic as well as an optimistic perspective, and you're purposefully putting your finger into a number of wounds, I would say, in order to kickstart the discussion. We will now move over to you, Deepesh, and then take it from there. Please, the floor is yours.
No, thank you, Katharina. Thank you, Isabella. It's a tremendous honor to be a part of this panel. And, my work has been mainly academic. I got interested in climate change not as a policy person, not as a scientist, not as an activist even, but because I thought the problem was so great that it actually posed a huge challenge to my discipline, history. And we normally do human history without thinking about natural history. We think of the earth as a stage on which human history happens. And, even when the climate crisis was happening and I'd already started to work on it, I would talk to my Indian friends, and this is in the around 2008-9, and my friends would say, "Look, we're just too small. The planet is too big. We can't affect it." And what we're realizing today is that we are much bigger than we thought we were, and the planet is not large enough. We can actually affect it. So, in some respects, it has produced a lot of conflicting aspirations, because on the one hand, many of our, we are still attached as human beings to the futures we used to imagine and dream up for ourselves back in the 1990s, 1980s. And that's one reason why governments in India and in China for a long time, even after the formation of IPCC, they used to be happy talking about historical responsibility, which was true, of the industrialized countries in producing the emissions, and the injustice of the impact of global warming falling more on the poor people and poorer nations. I mean, that was completely a right point, but they used to almost put that forward as though that was the only thing to be said. But as the crisis has gathered momentum, particularly since the Paris Climate Deal of 2015, I mean, countries are more aware of their responsibilities. But even so, when I talk to my Indian friends, I see many of them are just waiting for the pandemic to be finished so that they can resume global travel for holidays. Because I was reading somewhere that in 2000, 70% of the world's consuming classes, middle classes, were from the usual culprit countries, North Atlantic, West, Japan. And now, of the middle classes in the last 20, a bulk of them are coming from Asia, from China, India, Brazil, the emerging middle classes in Africa. And so on the one hand, so these classes and the people who are joining the middle classes, their aspirations in some ways are still tied to the period when we thought the only thing we had was globalization. So they want to lift themselves up, raise their standards of living. And just as they were doing it, they've come across the problem of global warming. So what I see, for instance, in Indian cities, all Indian cities are becoming hotter and hotter. They're becoming what they call heat islands. And the sale of air conditioners is booming. And it's booming not because people are buying their second or third or fourth air conditioners. It's booming because most people are buying their first ever air conditioner in life. And sometimes even in reasonably well-to-do slums, people are pooling money together and buying air conditioners. Indian air conditioners are poor, old technology. So they're actually terrible for the atmosphere. But for whatever reason, when countries met in Rwanda in 2016 to make a deal on air conditioning, India bargained hard to be among the countries that would be the slowest to change. Why? Because these people who are buying air conditioners for the first time, if you interview them, they'll tell you they're sleeping better. They have a sense of well-being. Their children are able to sit up all night and prepare for exams, like to get into medical school or law school or whatever they want to do. So they are thinking of their aspirations, the aspirations for their children. And then if you point out, but your actions are making your own city much hotter and more difficult to live in, you know what they'll tell you? They'll say, well, by the time this city becomes unlivable, my children will have acquired skills that would enable them to go somewhere else where it's better. So when you look at aspirations, what I see is that there are multiple aspirations. And I think ideally, as Isabella was saying, you want these aspirations to align so that you can address both questions of social justice, gender justice, and all of those things, as well as the questions of planetary justice. But at the national level, see, when you look at areas on the planet which are absolutely critical for the climate system, like the Amazon forests or the Himalayan glacier systems, it's so fascinating. The Himalayan glaciers are like other glaciers receding. But the Himalayan mountain range has become the most militarized mountain range in the world, because China, India, Pakistan have all assembled their armies and tanks and armors. They have, or each country has plans for building dams and things, very destructive activities. But that's because, as Isabella was saying, they only look on the Himalayas geopolitically, not geologically. Whereas I think the task today is to think both geopolitically, nationally, and geologically, to think about the planet having one climate system. So, I mean, Isabella would know much more about this because she's been right at the coalface of bargaining, and I'm just a distant academic. I teach classes on some of these problems, but look at the problem with the UN and the IPCC. See, so fundamentally, what happened after the Second World War was that both Russia, Soviet Union, and America began to take an interest in atmosphere because of nuclear fallouts, because of space competition, and because of the strategies on both sides developed during the Second World War of using weather as a military weapon. The question, can you cause floods in your enemy's territory? So out of that came atmospheric science, climate science, and eventually the IPCC was formed following the Montreal Protocol that was set up in dealing with the ozone hole, you'll remember, right? But look at the way the United Nations was set up as a bargaining counter. And nations go there to bargain for more time. So if you asked people the question, when will Israelis and Palestinians live in peace? They'll say, well, we're working at it. But look at the IPCC. The IPCC gives you a definite timetable for action, right? They say, if you don't do this by such and such time, this will happen. And then nations bargain. Even how much global warming was acceptable. We used to hear about 2 degrees Celsius, remember the average rise? And that was a politically bargained figure. Initially, IPCC used to say 1.5. So what you have is planetary science telling us about one kind of timetable for synchronized action. But that has to be taken through international politics, national politics, down to the level of state level, local level politics. And at each point, different problems emerge. I'll just give you 2 examples and then finish and open up the conversation. I was recently in India and I was in the coastal area. So I went to down south to Kerala. And they were pointing out to me that the fresh water is already becoming saline because the sea level has risen and is coming inland. So in poor families, women have to, because women do the cooking, they can't cook with local water because it's salty. So they have to go longer distance to get water for cooking. But this is not a vote-getting issue yet. So in the democratic cycle, this has not risen to the level of politics. But the other story I heard recently from the area that I come from, Bengal, where the Bengal Delta is, and there are poor fishing families where the women stand in waist-deep river water and with cane baskets catch river fish, small fish. But those waters have become salty. It's okay, they get small sea fish. But what happened, the very poor women, the seawater actually produces fungal infection and all kinds of other infections in their reproductive organs, including in the uterus. And a number of very bad, immoral doctors have moved in who are doing hysterectomy on these women. My feminist friends are fighting to have the state produce a law to regulate hysterectomy. Now, I would have never associated hysterectomy with climate change. But when you look at the effects of global warming are so different on so many scales and affect people through their inequalities, because vulnerability is based on social inequality, how vulnerable you are. And then for all this to be tied together through national governments who will then come together in international forums, bargain for time, but also unite on action, it seems to me that we'll most likely miss the IPCC timetables, which will mean that there'll be some problems. But it's probably better to focus on what's practical and doable at the local level, at multifarious levels, and try and bring these timetables together as much as we can. I was in Paris until very recently, and I was talking to some French academics who are also activists, and who are actually working on what they call ecologies of dismantlement in particular areas, but which I found where they were developing very interesting strategies. Nothing that will solve every problem at once. But I think we have to be practical, pragmatic, and do what we can on a very urgent basis. One thing that to me is very positive in developments in the 21st century is that climate change has become a more urgent issue. More people know about it. Whatever you think of Greta Thunberg personally, I think it was a great thing that school children got involved, because the future generations whose lives will be affected more have to be involved. There's a question of intergenerational justice. So the messaging is happening more, and I see my own role as an academic, both in the classroom and outside the classroom, as somebody who should participate in the messaging. I'll tell you honestly, even in the year 2000, many important and very important historians of the US universities that I know, a person at Harvard who wrote an article summarizing the 20th century, had not a word to say about climate change. Then that was 2000. IPCC had been set up 12 years before. But today, I think everybody's heard about it, at least among the educated.
Deepesh, thank you very much for your insights, and also your examples of people affected by sea level rise, by the interconnection basically of the effects of climate change and social inequalities. I think both of you, the way I heard you, both of you underline that aligning the aspirations of very different social groups across the world, across the different continents, but also across the different scale levels in policy making, is one of the key challenges of moving forward. And if I understand Isabella, you pointed to Rio 92. And one could say that in Rio 92, the aspirations were looking for sustainable futures. Yeah? It was a movement for finding ways towards sustainable futures. And nevertheless, 30 years later, we can question how successful we really were. Yeah? And we are again meeting in order to reflect, and meeting of course at many different levels, in order to reflect on how can we contribute to sustainable futures. So I would like us to now move into a bit of a ping-pong discussion along four questions. One, the historical perspective. You know, what makes us believe that aligning aspirations today differently or better than 30 years ago? What has changed? Is it the digital age that you pointed to, Isabella? Or is it the urgency of geopolitical competition, as well as the planetary boundaries and climate change? Then I would like us to reflect on the Agenda 2030 briefly. What does it mean when we discuss joint and commonly agreed on aspirations today, and reflect on the Agenda 2030? That exactly is that, a form of a jointly agreed agenda of the future, for the future. And then look at, but maybe with a perspective of on the Glasgow negotiations, the upcoming Glasgow negotiations, reflect on what can practically be done. Both of you pointed to the big transition economies as game changers in many ways, in terms of sustainable futures. At the same time, the challenge of historical responsibilities lying with some countries, and emissions continuing to increase in the large transition economies, and the challenges that bring this situation for political negotiation and climate policy making, actually. Maybe to take it from there. No? So aspirations 30 years ago, today, what has changed? Agenda 2030 and climate politics. Isabella.
Okay, I think that's a new webinar, okay, to answer your question. But let's see. First of all, the world changed, okay? It's not only the agenda changed, the world changed. It's different. When we discuss the Convention on Climate Change, or NFCCC in 1992, we discussed the future, the end of this century, as something untouchable. Today, if you have a son, probably he'll be alive at the end of the century. So the perspectives change, the world changed, the political perspective changed, and also scientific knowledge changed. It's very important because it's robust. And it was last 2 months ago that finally IPCC affirmed that the humankind is responsible for climate change, that our impact is indeed changing the world. It's not a probability, it was in the past. This is a truth. So this is important to understand this, what's changed, what is changing, what's changed in the past. Science became an important player at the global level because scientific knowledge means the scientific truth. If you can have this one side of the coin. The other side of the coin, you have this dispute that the professor mentioned, the politics of interest, of the politics of beliefs, that used to provoke tensions and conflicts, exactly to postpone solutions or to postpone actions that should address concrete solutions. Today, we are discussing actions. This is very important to observe. Of course, that's difficult to agree how to act. I'm not here to say that's easy, but it's very important to recognize that we cannot rely on the others to act. This is something very important to observe, in spite of the fact that we have CBDR. And shared responsibilities probably will assume different perspectives when we bring CBDR to try to negotiate, for example, international cooperation funds to mitigate versus international cooperation funds to promote adaptation. Different perspectives. It's really different perspectives. It's very important to observe this because it was different in the past. I was there in 92. I was too young, of course, but I was there, okay? And I remember the dispute that you had considered developing countries to be convinced of the problem and to recognize the importance to sign a global convention to address global problems, like climate change and biodiversity, and also desertification. My point here is that we cannot forget that we need to act, but we need to act, recognize not only the past, but the ambition that we want for the future. And this is sometimes very difficult when you go into the negotiations because people want to discuss only the past, not we need to change, okay, to be in the future. And this means that developing economies should find should recognize the challenges and not the dispute of the past, but the challenge to be together in the future. And this is not clear again. Let's give an example. Consider Amazon region that everyone's, including myself, we are very worried about what's happening today in Brazil, the pressure on deforestation and the consequence. But it's not the only Amazon region. You go into the 3 tropical forests assets in the world, Amazon region, Congo Basin, and Mekong Basin, and the low socio-economic realities on that region. And you go with Amazon region in my country. I don't know if you know this, but we have in Brazil, Amazon region means almost more than 55% of the Brazilian territory. Okay, it's more than half of our territory. You have 27 million people that live there. 27 million people live in Amazon in Brazil. And 80% of this population live in cities. So when you go into this reality, and I was carefully listening here to Professor Depeche, and understand the ambition of middle class in Amazon region, it's not the ambition of indigenous people, traditional communities. They had other values, and you need to understand the value of this value of disasters, the diversity of situations, exactly to think strategic, not only how to stop deforestation. Deforestation is based on illegality, must stay behind, but how will promote development in that region, inclusive and fair development, and also promote the forest protection and the climate security. It's not the climate, the carbon, only fixed carbon, the carbon price. No, without Amazon protection, no 1.50 degrees. Only this. So we need solidarity for Amazon people. We need solidarity from Brazilian people, etc., to have climate stability. This is a new approach for international cooperation and also for to have common aspirations. We need to understand our role, not only nationally, locally, but our role internationally. That's why I mentioned before that, in my opinion, we should not act based on national interests. We need to go with that global interests. We need to understand local needs and try to facilitate, to engage the local needs in such a way that we can address global co-benefits, because we need to go into the realities, local ones, and we need to make clear how to manage this to promote solutions. And only to illustrate, to conclude here, if you allow me, Anna, I will give another example, consider Amazon region. When you go into Brazil and also the other countries that are part of Amazon basin, like Peru, Colombia, and Bolivia, Ecuador, all these countries, Professor, they are middle-income economies, okay? But when you go into Amazon region, in all the countries, you have low-income partners. And international cooperation is not able to see this. So we want to protect, you want to play together with the countries, but you don't have the right lens to address concrete solutions in such a way that you can bring common aspirations together with global ambition. This is really a clear example how international institutions, international cooperation, international arrangements, they are not enough. Consider the lens that you need to address concrete solutions for the global crisis in this century. So as you mentioned, I think that Rio 92 was able to bring this lens, the first approach to understand Sustainable Development Goals. When you go into 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals, I proposed this. I was a member of the high-level panel that proposed this. What is this? You have alternatives. You can combine different things because the narratives are there. But the narrative is not, you cannot see narratives as something that we need to affirm because we have fake news. No, because we have alternatives. We have options to address concrete solutions considering local needs and local realities. This is, for me, the power of the Sustainable Development Goals, because it allows you, independently of the global crisis, how we should be part of this new global game, with concrete outcomes for your local benefits. If you're not able to bring Johns, Harrys, Marys to understand that they are not only exposed to climate risks, but they are part of the solution, they will still be there as victims or, as we used to say, part of the problems. And climate, in the past, you used to say this, on climate you have two sides. You are part of the problem or you are part of the solution. I don't agree with this today. We are part of the problems and the solutions because we are the same boards. We need to understand that we need to go beyond the situation that we have today and bring the past to manage this better, but not to block the next steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabella. I would like to give you, Depeche, the word, but very briefly, allow me to capture or pull something out of Isabella's statement. Isabella, you underline that the Agenda 2030 was indeed a participatory process that involved the aspirations of very many different social groups around the planet in shaping the agenda, and that it allows a flexible combination of different alternative futures, basically, and imaginaries of future. So it allows the alignment of aspirations in different combinations. And nevertheless, the COVID-19 pandemic makes us question whether the formulated goals are reachable, whether they, while we need ambitious guiding lamps, no, whether they might be too ambitious so that they can no longer guide, no longer inspire, but rather sort of turn into unreachables that do not foster positive action, but rather maybe even spur discontent to a degree that the mentioned polarization in our societies that you already pointed to takes hold even more. So Deepesh, maybe you can please come in. How do you reflect on it? Yeah.
I mean, I agree with what Isabella was saying, and some of her positions were what you'd call normative positions. She was really saying what we should do, what we need to do. She was not always describing what we actually do. But in one of her interviews, when she emphasizes, she makes the point that a lot depends on who you have as political leaders in your nation. I mean, the Trump years were bad for dealing with climate question, much worse than the Biden presidency. And that goes for every country. I mean, it depends on who you, and see, and behind that is this point that any democracy reflects disagreements. So think of the pandemic. I mean, I think the pandemic and climate problem are connected problems. They're not disconnected problems. Because Anthony Fauci, the American advisor of the president, I mean, he's been saying in a number of papers recently that we have entered an era of pandemics. That pandemics can happen with more frequency, and the major reason he says this, the United Nations report on zoonotic diseases says this, the World Wide Fund report says this, is the cutting down of forests, and wildlife losing their habitat, forcing them to come close to us through intermediate animals and things. And when I read in that literature, I see that from 2007, virologists and infectious disease specialists have been warning governments of a possible pandemic, and governments were not listening. Now that a pandemic has happened, while the long-term response should be to not cut down forests to the degree where we are focused on vaccination. Then even there you can see human disagreement. Not only is there vaccine inequality, there's resistance to vaccine based on misinformation, based on religious beliefs, all kinds of things. In America, in the United States, it's quite high, the degree of resistance. Whereas, as I said, the French government behaving somewhat differently to the United States. So it seems to me that one of the things that needs to happen in terms of Isabella's language is what needs to happen. I think there's a need to convince the powerful and the rich people of the world that this is their problem as well. Climate change is not just a problem for poor people. It is their problem. California is burning, Australia burns, right? The rich suffer differently, not in the way that the poor suffer. And this Elon Musk proposal that will go and inhabit Mars is just a wild dream. I mean, he has money to burn. Some people are stupid enough to think that you can't colonize the way that you colonized Latin America or Australia or Africa. You're not going to start a settler colony on Mars so easily. And therefore, we have this planet. So I think the messaging seems to be very important at that level too. And then the political processes, we need institutions, multilateral institutions, to deal with certain parts of the world. And one of the important problems in the climate problem, in dealing with the climate problem, is that, see, there are parts of the planet that affect climate that, in a sense, belongs to nobody, no particular nation. So the deep oceans affect climate. And what happens? So the oceans have been absorbing most of the heat that we've been producing. So this, what Isabella was calling global, and I think of as planetary. So actually for us to learn to think not only globally, but also planetarily. In other words, to realize that, for instance, the oxygen we breathe and we are so dependent on, most of the COVID deaths in India happened because industrialized oxygen was available to the degree it should have been. That oxygen is produced by forms of life we think of as inferior forms of life, phytoplanktons, plants, fungi, bacteria. But on the other hand, we behave as though this oxygen is for us. We can do anything to bacteria and plants and the seas. See, if the sea temperature increases by, let's say, on an average by 6 degrees Celsius, which hopefully won't happen, but if it did, phytoplanktons will die, and that would mean that we will shut off 50% of the oxygen supply that we need there. So politicians have to learn to think beyond nation states' interests and beyond just global human interests. They have to think about humanity. They have to learn to think that humanity is on this planet, and the planet is not just a stage. The planetary processes play a role in making this planet livable, and other forms of life. So biodiversity question. Biodiversity is not just a sustainability problem. It's a problem of whether life will exist on this planet or not. And the difficulty is that, see, the pandemic, people often ask me, how long did the 1918 pandemic last? And historians say 4 years. So they think, okay, if I can ride out these 4 years, I'll be fine. I'll get back to what? I mean, today it was interesting reading the Harvard professor say, this is a COVID decade, not just 4 years, right? We're not going to go back to the future, to the past we had as our future. But the thing is, at least this is a short range. You can think, okay, we all want to be in the same, we can inhabit this. But loss can lead to a huge extinction of life. But that is not an immediate problem. And sometimes we have difficulty imagining ourselves as inhabiting, let's say, 200 years or even 100 years. That's why I think Isabella's point that the more you have living human beings, whose lives are going to be badly affected. So the fact that there are 20-year-olds today, who will be living into the parts of the century that I won't live into, and to bring them into the debate, to educate them, and from all classes, is important, because I think I often feel, at least in India, I see that the politicians who were trained in the 1980s, 90s, like in other Prime Minister Modi, I mean, their imagination is actually molded by that, and they think of climate change as just one problem they have to deal with diplomatically, or renewable energy profits. It's a deeper problem. So maybe I'll stop there and say what she wants to say and come back.
Thanks, Dipesh. And we are, of course, fighting against the time, as always. We have a question under the Q&A, and I would also like to invite the audience for additional questions. This is now the chance. We only, unfortunately, have 8 minutes left. While maybe additional ones will come in, I would like to share the one that is in the Q&A already with both of you. Basically, the question is, well, you are arguing that the rich and powerful have to be brought into the debate, that they are aware of the fact that they are affected by climate change. And the question then is, what political strategies could you imagine to appeal to these actors to redistribute power? It's a question to both of you. The question then continues, pointing to the militarization of environmental issues that often takes the forefront in these conversations, and is then linked to questions of global migration to and questions of polarization processes. So what are the pathways to global solidarity that you can imagine? Actually 2 questions, not very easy, but what are the political strategies to redistribute power and wealth? And how does the pathway to global solidarity then look like? Isabella.
I think
We
that
only
Okay,
have 7
I
minutes
read
left,
out- I
so
read
I
out-
ask
I
you to
know,
be quite brief. Yeah.
I know that I have to manage the time. I think I'll try to answer this very briefly because they are really good questions. And first point, Dipesh, when I used to say globally, my generation used to say globally, greater generation used to say planetary. This is very important to observe. This is the challenge that you have to bring the two generations together. It's a really good point because I as a biologist, I think, of course, as a planet, but politically, when discussing Paris Agreement implementation, not necessarily have the new mindset, a shared mindset to understand the transition between globally to planetary. It's very important at this point. Second point, when discuss how do you say, migration and the climate crisis. I try to summarize here because I don't have much time, but one, and also militarization. One of the key debates about climate change in the future is exactly human integrity. And you have three dimensions of that people used to discuss this. The first one is exactly climate crisis, how exposed we are to climate risks. And that's why you have different constituents today looking forward to go into the climate agenda. And this is really a big challenge for climate governance, the new climate governance that should emerge after COP26. I do hope that we can conclude the negotiation because we need to go into action and this new global climate governance. But independent of this, you need to understand that human integrity will bring climate, health, global public health. This is absolutely, it was before pandemic and after the pandemic, this is really a key issue. And also migrations, because you have this new additional pressure considering environmental rights or environmental quality and its climate rights coming into the human rights agenda. This is very important to observe because migrations will be one of the key issue, in my opinion, to put pressure on the geopolitical arrangements and how indeed we'll deal with climate crisis, not only on mitigation, but also meaning adaptation. Adaptation used to be national agenda. So no one's put the focus, only the developing, the vulnerable countries put the focus on adaptation, and the other countries used to just put the pressure, put the focus on mitigation because mitigation means that you can protect all the countries around the world. This is very important to observe because my feelings is that when you go into global solidarity, we need to discuss better, as the new report from the Secretary General of United Nations shows, our common agenda, how we address global commons. How indeed we're looking for, I think that Anna mentioned planetary boundaries, but I think that we need to understand better what are the new concepts that will come in, consider shared responsibilities and how indeed we would like to influence our responsibilities, consider our potential impact. So if you're not able to protect the forests, it's not only Brazil, the other countries around the world, you are co-responsible, consider the risks that we are absolutely exposed. It's a new mindset, political and economic and social, that should emerge. And I do believe that we need to work hard the next 10 years, this decade, if you take the decision not to postpone, but to face, to tackle climate change in another perspective. And you cannot do this without democracy. Please, don't go into the politics of beliefs, don't go into the climate negationism, and don't go into the climate fatalism. We need to understand and to believe that we have difficulties, but we can move forward. I do believe that we can do this. Anna, back to you, sorry.
Thank you, Isabella. And Dipesh, I will hand over to you for your also final remarks, and would like to briefly link it to one more question that was in the Q&A. A question that asks after how can we assure that those states that are uncooperative and do not contribute to the alignment of Agenda 2030 and the Paris agreements, reaching the climate goals, are being pushed into a situation where they have to also cooperate. And of course, then the question is, who has the right to push another state into cooperation? Maybe you can link.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, I think we're at a point in history where the nation state is an inadequate instrument.
It's a necessary instrument. It's there. It's historically evolved. No one is going to cancel the nation state.
It's going to be there, but it's proving its inadequacy on many fronts for dealing with climate change. And I think I completely that
adaptation should be taken on as a human issue throughout the world, not national.
Not a national issue. And that connects with the question of sea level rise, climate refugees. The UN doesn't have a definition. The UN has to work on actually making
it an official category. And so that's a certain kind of
anti-migration politics that some countries are developing, which is very nation-focused, nation-centered. You know, needs to point out the
short-sightedness of that problem, because we are reaching a point where there needs to be a redistribution of population.
And this is a very difficult thing when many countries, including India, are championing, you know, politics which are actually not about welcoming immigrants
or even asylum seekers
from other nations. So this is a big thing to work on. A French academic friend, actually, Pierre Chabonnier, like just naming
him to acknowledge him. For the idea is we want to get to a stage where children are given an ecological consciousness
in the same way that they're taught numbers. Human beings need to have a different mindset. And we need to bring up our children
to be ecologically as aware as they are of the number system.
I mean, this should be coming in the way that academics now are trained to think about gender questions. Right? And this can be done. I mean, so at least as a teacher, if you talk about institution, I feel
already some of my colleagues are working on how to bring these questions
into school syllabi. And I think academics have to work with school teachers, with local problems, develop curricula
through which children acquire this, young people acquire this awareness.
And
Isabella is much better placed
on the political question of how do you pressure the rich and the powerful to align themselves with what needs to happen. I mean, she's the one with the
real experience there to talk about it.
Thank you. We are actually out of time, but Isabella, please come in with one sentence on how do we pressure the rich and powerful.
Oh, how you pressure? Make sure that you have the solution on your domain. If you're not able to put this in practice, you're not a leader. You recognize as a leadership, okay? And it's as a power of the leadership, not the power, not the political power, the power of leadership to mobilize people in the right direction, not in wrong direction. That don't have solutions of the past that will be in the future. So what the new generation say, we need to have people that you can believe. And I think that everyone's life should be approached in a positive way as a leader that able to go into the future based on concrete solutions with pragmatism, but also with optimism. I do believe that we need a new humanism, a new expression of humanism in this century. This means leadership and means hope, of course. And this is based on our beliefs. And that's why we as a Homo sapiens can make a difference in a positive way.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. I've heard that we need action. We need this action now. We need it across scales, across different societal groups. Leadership plays an important role, but it's also in the raising of our kids and how we nurture the awareness of the limitedness of our planet amongst the younger generation, that the pathways to sustainability-oriented policy making are built.
And may I add a final comment? Only to say two things. This is based on my own experience. So I was there in my nation discussing and proposing sustainable development goals. I was at Rio Plus Trade Conference discussing the arrangement, and after this we have Agenda 2030. I was member of this high-level panel. My reality today in my neighborhood here in Brazil, exactly to address the implementation as a citizen, okay, of sustainable development goals. All the neighborhood here put this in practice, okay, and this is part of my reality. It's so amazing that you can understand how local needs indeed make sense for everyone, okay? Despite of the fact that to go into the political rooms with the power, the expression of the political power. Powership means that you're able to change and to influence quality of life of people. Never forget it. Never, never forget it. So we are able to do this. Be sure that the climate will go beyond this COP and will be able to understand what are the real challenges considering the new climate governance challenges in the world. And I think that when I mentioned adaptation, Dipesh very clearly understood this. We need to bring adaptation as an asset, not because we need international funds, but as an asset, political asset to bring developing and developed countries together. Please don't forget it. We cannot increase the gap between developing and developing countries. We need to come together and to understand how adaptation should play this important bridge to have a better world in the next years. I do hope that we can do this. We only have to work hard and have you together with us. Thank you very much. Dipesh, my honor. Okay.
Thank you. My honor too.
I hope that we can discuss another opportunity.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. It's been an honor to discuss with both of you. And now we have Elizabeth Hege, who is a senior researcher at IDRI, working on the Agenda 2030, saying a few more words on the upcoming panel. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Anna-Katharina. The German Development Institute is a dear friend and partner of IDRI in the European Think Tanks group. And thank you to the inspiring panelists and the dear audience behind the screens. So you are part of IDRI's birthday party, so to speak. This is the conference for IDRI's 20th birthday on Next Generation Multilateralism, Planetary Governance for Sustainable Recovery. It is organized by IDRI and the European Chair on Sustainable Development of Sciences Po Paris. And there's a next session, so if you want to stay a little longer on the birthday party, there's the next session will start at 6:30 and until 8:30 p.m. and it's called Sustainability as a Lever for Renewal. If you want to join us for this next session, you can push the button below, which is called Toutes les sessions in French, or probably all sessions in English. So please stay with us a little bit longer, and many thanks again to the panelists and the chair. Merci beaucoup. À bientôt.
Thank you.
Bye-bye then, Katharina and Elizabeth.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.